I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everybody to the first of 4 trainings that we're providing today for the MPO, for the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the Laredo and Webb County area MPO. Our intent in doing this is something, as the director of the planning department and also the director of the MPO, that my staff and I, we've wanted to provide trainings for all of our commissions, all of our boards, our council, and our committees, our policy committee and our technical committee, when we can. We want to do this on an ongoing basis, and there was a lot of interest for staff both on the city and county side to understand and learn more about the MPO. So that's the purpose of what we're doing here. Is this first session is going to provide a very basic overview of what the MPO is, its history, what it does, where the funding comes from. The 3 sessions this afternoon will go into a little more in depth into areas that we thought would be of particular interest to folks here. Now, I'm going to ask that everybody please mute your mic when you're not speaking. And Bill, how would you like to handle this? Do you want there to be questions reserved at the end, or would you want people to jump in? Given the amount of people that are in this meeting, it might be better to wait till the end to have a Q&A session, but I'll leave that up to you. How you want to handle it, Bill?
That's probably the most organized way to do it, but I'm not opposed to, if there's a point that's really not getting across to someone, I don't mind if someone does jump in and say, I'm kind of lost, or can you go back and explain something? Because I'm as much for this to be sort of a workshop as anything else.
Okay, we appreciate that. So
Yeah.
generally, let's reserve questions till the end, but if there's something that really you just feel like you have a question, you really need to clarify a point, then Bill's okay with you jumping in. But generally, let's try to hold questions at the end because we have about 30 plus participants today. So again, this meeting is being recorded. For those that have missed it, we'll make sure it's available or couldn't make today's meeting. And we will do that with all the sessions today. So if there was a session later this afternoon you couldn't make, don't worry, we'll send that out to you. And again, just as a reminder, if you can keep your mics muted, that way it preserves the audio quality so that everybody can hear well during the meeting. With that, let me give a very brief introduction. I'm sure Bill will introduce himself a little more, but Bill Frawley is with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. They have a contract with TxDOT to provide training for all of the MPOs in the state of Texas, and not only training, but also assistance when we work on projects. So they have been extremely helpful. Bill in particular has been extremely helpful, helping us over this last year and a half, we've been evolving the MPO to add more staff and to do additional planning internally. And we really thank Bill for his help. And Bill, thank you very much for making the time today to give us this training.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for your kind words and introduction, Kirby. As I'll say sometimes, of all the introductions I've ever received, that's the most recent. So anyway, no, it's been a pleasure to work with the Laredo MPO staff on a variety of things, and my hat's off to Kirby. He has taken the reins at this MPO and done a lot of things with increasing staff and staff capabilities that's not been done ever before. And this is really, I think, setting the Laredo MPO on a path for great success, improved success in the future. So I just want to kind of make that verbal commendation to everyone who's participating right now. As Kirby said, my name is Bill Frawley. I'm with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, which is a research arm of Texas A&M University. Our headquarters is on the A&M campus. I'm up in Arlington in an office, and we have offices around the state and a variety of people that can help with things. And so, but I'm looking forward to just sharing some information. I've been working with transportation planning issues for 30 years now, and with TTI for over 27 years. And so I've got a lot of variety of experiences that I think are going to help out from different places and seeing a variety of things. I also have Kirk Favre from Federal Highway Administration. He's actually going to lead the second final 2 presentations in the afternoon, because I have found that sometimes it's helpful to get the federal perspective on a couple of things, especially when it gets into Title VI, EJ, and some other things. And he and I work together a lot on delivering some of these types of things. So, but we're both here to help answer questions. But I appreciate Kirk being here to help out with the the federal perspective on some things. And as Kirby mentioned, I want to make sure we make clear that TxDOT is the agency, the Transportation Planning and Programming Division, that makes this happen. We have an interagency contract that allows us to go to MPOs and districts all over the state to do trainings like this, help with coaching, mentoring, prepare for certification reviews, a whole variety of things. And I don't know that there's another DOT in the country that supports their MPOs like TxDOT does, and especially through a contract like this. So once again, thank you everyone that's here for making time for this workshop. Hope that it's useful. And again, questions are probably best at the end, but if there's something that we find out that, hey, let's go ahead and make a clarification that's necessary, let's just do that. That's fine also. So I think Matt Miller in our Austin office is running the slides for me. So Matt, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. So just as far as some expectations and outcomes, someone is going to ask, well, why am I here? Why did I sign up for this? Or why am I spending time on this? Basically, it's kind of like Kirby said, it's going to be to give an overall understanding of what the MPO is, what it's all about, the roles, the purposes, some of the major accomplishments that have to be done by staff, TAC, policy board, and so on. And it's a refresher for some people, and for some, it's a brand new information. So we're gonna hit all the audiences. Next. So with this, I want to go into just a little bit of history and purposes of the MPO. I've got a fair amount of information for legislative background. I'm just going to tell you ahead, I'm not going to read every one of these slides, but this information is here to provide some background information that you can go back to and refer to at points in the future. Go ahead and do the next one. So back in 1962, there was a Federal Aid Highway Act. That's what basically said we're going to have some type of planning organizations at the local and regional levels where they get to become involved as much as the state governments and the federal government. It was primarily in response to the development of the interstate highway system. And the federal government saw that there's some needs for metropolitan areas to have some say with the local level on how transportation planning is done. There were already some major metro areas in the country, especially in the Northeast, that had similar type organizations, but this put it into play. And then in 1965, some grant funding was provided for the planning operations to pay for staff salary, consultants, other needs just to make the planning happen. Next. So in case you ever want to go look it up, or if you hear people talk about Texas administrative code, all the transportation stuff is found in Title 42. Part 1 is TxDOT. There's other parts that have to do with other agencies like DPS and otherwise. And then Chapter 16 is where we get into planning and development of transportation projects. And there's other chapters as well related to transportation issues, but this is the main one for what we're doing. Next. The federal laws, Title 23 of the United States Code is where all the rules are set out that come out of the legislative bills that we'll talk about in a minute. Section 134 is for metropolitan planning, 135 statewide non-metro means basically rural. And then Title 49 has all the transit stuff. Notice that it says Chapter 53 down there. That's because if you are familiar with transit, you'll realize, oh, wow, there's 5303 grants, 5304 grants, is all the different funding comes out of Chapter 53. So that's where those numbers come from. Next. And then here's information on where the Code of Federal Regulations has in Chapter 23 or Section 20, Chapter 23, excuse me, Title 23 is for the highway side of things, and Title 49 is for transit. So that's there if you ever want to go back and look to it, and they're actually linked. Next. So most people might be aware that the Congress at the federal level every so often adopts a new transportation legislation. For a long time, it was pretty much like clockwork. It was being done about every 6 years. Then at some point in time, kind of politics got into play and there became some delays, and they would have to do some continuing resolutions. So you could see ICE-T, which was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act in 1991. That went for 6 years. And then the next year, T21 came into effect. And then you can see it was a couple of years before Safety Lou came into effect, and so on. At those times and those gaps, there's continuing resolutions, and that's what we are under right now because our current FAST Act has expired, and they've passed a continuing resolution to assure funding and other things that'll keep on going in the meantime. All of these bills basically have the latest rules for transportation planning, or the requirements for the rules to get codified. So every time we have a new legislative bill, one, it provides funding for construction, for planning, and all those types of things. It also has some rules that have to be enacted through the Federal Code of Regulations, the FCR, like we saw previously. Next. So just real basics. What is an MPO? If you have an urbanized area as defined by the Census Bureau, that has 50,000 population or more, you have to have an MPO. And that's what came out of the 1960s legislation. The Census Bureau is the one that, by clustering up or grouping census blocks, census tracts, and so on with certain population densities, that's how these 50,000 and so on are designated. And this happens every 10 years once the U.S. Census, decennial census data are completed and reported. If you have over 200,000 population, then it's called a transportation management area, and that's what Laredo is. Sorry, I got distracted by an incoming email. The TMAs have over 200,000 population, and they have additional requirements, and they also receive some additional funding. So you do, and we'll talk about that when we get into some funding and some other type things. One of those requirements is that you have to have a federal certification review every 4 years. And that's where the federal partners, Federal Transit, Federal Highway Administration come in and do an enhanced planning review. Take a look at all your processes, all your documents, make sure you're following all the rules and doing everything in the spirit of what's required. And y'all just had one recently, and that went very well, actually. So you've passed with flying colors and good for another 4 years. Just FYI trivia, there's over 400 MPOs in the country right now. There's 23 in Texas. There were 25, but 3 of them down in the Rio Grande Valley merged into one just in the last year. Next. So, okay, now that we know when you have to have an MPO, what is the MPO? Well, basically, it's an agency responsible for planning and programming transportation projects for the identified metropolitan area. And that metro area is an area that's your census designated urbanized area, like we talked about before, as well as land beyond that, which may become urbanized over the next 25 years or so. So that's what the responsibility is for. It's that urbanized area. So it's not just the city of Laredo. It goes into Webb County and so on. The staff is kind of the core part of the MPO. They coordinate efforts with stakeholder agencies like TxDOT, the transit agency, other agencies, the county, the city, and so on, to bring everyone together to make sure there's a coordinated process. And we're going to talk about what's called the 3C process in a little bit. That was just a little bit of a sneak peek. The staff performs sometimes in-house, sometimes through contracts, all the planning functions, develop a 25-year metropolitan transportation plan, some specialized studies like bicycle pedestrian plans, feasibility type studies, corridor studies, and so on. And then typically they'll present information to the technical advisory committee, which gets forwarded on to the Transportation Policy Board. And so the next slide will explain those. Next.
Bill, can I jump in with a comment?
Yeah, please do.
Our MPO last year was interested in doing something similar that the Valley did, joining with other areas, and that's one of the clarifications we needed to provide, was that the geography for an MPO isn't arbitrary, and it has to be an area that exceeds a certain amount of density and population, or it will become a dense area in the next 25 years. So us joining with Del Rio or somewhere north of us can't happen because we have to have that connected urbanized area that happens within 25 years, and that's not going to be the case for Laredo. We won't really expand beyond our county, but definitely not beyond our county, but really not beyond our MPO current boundaries for the next 25 years in terms of what's going to be developed and urbanized.
That's a good point, Kirby. And made me realize, yeah, there's probably some interest in what's going on up in Eagle Pass and Del Rio. And both of those areas are potentially going to surpass the 50,000 mark, even though their city populations might not. The urbanized areas designated by the Census Bureau may, but you're right. There's too much unurbanized and won't be urbanized in the next 25 years between Laredo and them to combine into one. Good point. Thanks for bringing that up. It's very local interest there. Good. Next slide. Okay, so Technical Advisory Committee. Some of you participating today sit on the Technical Advisory Committee, and typically staff from member agencies, the city, the county, and so on. But sometimes there's stakeholder agencies as well that'll have members on the Technical Advisory Committee. They receive information from the staff. They MPO staff. They'll also provide information and data to the MPO staff to help out with reports and studies and so on. And that's a lot of where kind of to a certain degree the sausage is made. This is where a lot of interaction occurs and cooperative type things happen. Then the Transportation Policy Board is made up typically primarily of elected officials and sometimes some other representatives from member agencies. But frequently, like you do, you're going to have mayors, some city council persons, county judge, county commissioner type people. Those representatives are up to those agencies. But this is where you're really getting the local voice involved in transportation planning and programming decisions. The state DOT, TxDOT, has at least one person on the policy board. Transit is represented and has to be represented in a TMA, being over 200,000 population. Y'all have that representation. And there can be some other persons on there as well. The primary role for the policy board, and this is so important, is to make the transportation planning and programming decisions, including approving any of the necessary documents, plans and programs and so on. And I'm using these two words, planning and programming, and we're going to talk in a little while about the difference between those two things. Next. So this is a sneak peek at something that's going to come up this afternoon in the first session. But I've mentioned this kind of cooperative spirit that has to happen. The MPO is required by federal rules to have a 3C process. And those 3 C's are comprehensive, continuing, and cooperative. And we're going to go into details on all of those, but kind of the sneak peek so that you'll kind of follow along. Comprehensive means we're talking about all modes. Continuing means it's a cyclical thing that never ends. We're always planning and always updating or starting the next plan. And then it's cooperative, meaning all the different agencies and stakeholders come together and work out solutions together. Next. What I'd like to talk about next, and I guess, Kirby, this might be a good time before I begin this little session. Does anyone have a burning question right now? Okay. So let's talk about funding categories, because this is where we find out what type of money and which types of money are we, do we qualify for in the Laredo area. TxDOT has 12 funding categories of construction type money for projects, and this is on the highway side. Again, transit has their whole set of the 53 and so 5303, 5304, 5339, and so on. But right now we're talking about funding categories for construction of roadways and related things. Every state can divide these up the way they want to. Believe it or not, back in the 90s, TxDOT had, I believe it was 39 different funding categories. Some of them very specific, but they went through a process to narrow that down to 12, and it makes really good sense the way they have it set up. So category 1 is preventative maintenance and rehabilitation. Basically, this is just what it says: fixing potholes, keeping pavement structure going, just trying to keep the roads in good shape. This is where you're managing the assets that are already out there, preserving the system as it exists. That is money that can be spent. Each TxDOT district gets an allocation of that, and they can spend that however they need to throughout the entire TxDOT district, which will include several counties, and Laredo is home to a TxDOT district headquarters. Category 2 is metro and urban area corridors, and there's actually 2 subcategories. One is for the larger areas, and another one is for the smaller areas. Basically, this is a combination of funds, federal funds that come from the federal government, as well as some state funds, especially Proposition 1 and Proposition 7 funds. Proposition 1 being severance tax, so based on oil and natural gas production. Category 7 based on motor fuel sales tax and some other transportation-related taxes, vehicle registration, and so on. Those are allocations that are distributed by formula based on about 7 criteria to the various metropolitan areas. And that's where the bulk of the money is available to do projects on the state highway system. And when we say on the state highway system, that includes interstate highways, U.S. designated highways like U.S. 59, loops, state spurs, FM roads, those types of things. Right now, and for quite a while now, and for the foreseeable future, TxDOT is limiting the spending of Category 2 funds to on-system roads only. If someone would like to propose something different to TxDOT, they're free to do that, but it's very small chance that they're going to have Category 2 funds spent on off-system, meaning city or county roads, basically. Category 3 is what they call non-traditionally funded projects. This is basically where you get some local contributions. Maybe it's from an economic development corporation, a city, or a county, but it's other than the federal or state funds. It can be private sector funding. Sometimes corporations, developers will pitch in money to help with a project and so on. Category 4 is statewide connectivity, and there's 2 branches of this, rural and urban, basically. And so part of this is handled out of the TxDOT district office. Some of it's handled at the statewide level by the Texas Transportation Commission. These are funds that you don't really get necessarily by allocation or formula, but there's funds available out there for major roadways that help connect urban areas and major rural routes into and out of urban areas. Category 5 is congestion mitigation and air quality, or it's abbreviated CMAQ. This is a funding that's only available to areas that are in non-attainment status of air quality standards, or in a maintenance of those things. Maybe they're about to go into non-attainment or they're coming out of it. It's kind of the there's a double-edged sword here. If you get these funds, great, you have more money, but the bad thing is you're having to go through a lot of air quality issues. Fortunately for Laredo, y'all have good air quality, and you don't get these funds, but you don't have to deal with all the headaches that come with it as well. Structure and bridge basically is category 6, and this is done on a statewide basis. If there's some folks that have been in transportation for 20 or 30 years like I have, you might remember that back even into the 90s, and I can't remember at what time they stopped, but every TxDOT district would receive an allocation of bridge funding, and that's no more. Now they assess all the bridges on a statewide basis and basically just go down the list from the worst ones and see how far the money will last. But this is where bridges get replaced that are in poor condition. Sometimes they might do some enhancement or expansion along with a replacement type thing, but this is what takes care of those poor quality or situation bridges. Next. Category 7 is metropolitan mobility and rehabilitation. This is money that only goes to TMAs. So this is a good source of money that Laredo gets. It comes from the federal government, passes through TxDOT, but it's based on a formula basically on population. And the federal government says all of these TMAs need this money to be able to do additional work on their highways. This is the money that can be spent on the state highway system, off the state highway system, transit, bike ped. It's got a lot fewer restrictions than, say, the Category 2 funds have. And typically, it's up to each of the MPOs. How do they want to use and allocate that source of funding? This is where the policy board has the greatest amount of say on this type of funding compared to any of the rest of them, including the Category 2 funds. Category 8 is safety, and this is done on a statewide basis also. A lot of it, some of it at least, is done on a competitive nature to address safety issues, to help bring everything into compliance with the state highway safety plan. So that's one that the TxDOT district usually takes the lead in seeking out these funds. Category 9 is transportation alternatives. There's two parts of this one, like some of the others. All of the TMAs, including Laredo, get a certain amount of transportation alternative funds called, its acronym right now is TASA. And that's money that's really primarily for bicycle, pedestrian, things that don't really add lanes and capacity, but other features to the transportation system, especially for what's sometimes called active transportation, bike ped, and so on. And then for the non-TMAs, the ones below 200,000 population, they can apply for a statewide source of this money to do those same types of projects. Then category 10 is supplemental transportation projects. There's a variety of things in here. There's been some border infrastructure projects, energy sector corridor projects, and so on. There's a variety of things in there. And that's allocated out to different districts, either because they qualified for something like energy sector, border sector, those types of things. Category 11 is district discretionary. All 25 TxDOT districts get an allocation. It's typically not very much. It doesn't go very far, but this allows the district engineer and his or her staff to say, hey, we've got a little bit of a gap in funding, or we need to help take care of something. A lot of times, and rightfully so, this money might get spent out more in the rural areas of the district because they don't get as much other typical funding dedicated to them. And then category 12, this is one of the largest, or probably possibly the largest source of funding overall. Strategic priority. The Texas Transportation Commission, or sometimes just called the Commission, 5-member board appointed by the governor, has the authority to use this funding to help supplement funding for projects, especially if they're of major regional or statewide importance. This will be done sometimes when, let's say the conversion of US 69 into Laredo at some point will, I would assume, and this is no promise by any means, I don't have the authority to do that, but that's a likely candidate for some category 12 money. The commission would say, there's no way Laredo can afford to convert US 59 to Interstate 69. So we will inject quite a bit of money to make that happen. This has been done in other places on the I-69 corridor. I've seen it happen to help complete a loop around a city, to help expand or improve other types of interstate corridors, whether it's expansion, conversion of frontage roads from two-way to one-way, and so on. So what's really important to know about this one is it is up to the commission. It's important for the MPO to let the commission know what the needs are. And this is a case where when you have the opportunity to leverage some of your category 2 and even your category 7 funds that are more locally with the MPO in coordination with the district controlled, you're more likely to get larger amounts of the strategic priority funding from category 12 to help get projects accomplished.
Bill, may I make a comment?
Yeah, please do.
I'm sending a link in the chat that everybody can look at. It is a link to the state's UTP, which is their Unified Transportation Program plan. So every year they have to create a plan that shows how much money they have in each of these categories, and also shows the formulas they use, because some of these categories are formulaic, some are more discretionary. And if you want to see the latest plan, that's the link that I just sent to you. It has I set it so that it opens right on the page that has the funding for each of these categories. And you can see, like Bill said, that strategic priority is the biggest one. It's got $16 billion in it for 2021, 2021. And the second is the first category. And then you can see the others, the smaller categories. But important in there is also the formulas of how those categories are put together. And one question I wanted to ask for you, Bill, is one
Yeah.
thing that's been important to the policy committee here and the technical committee as well is that we feel like the formulas that look at how much funding goes for freight is maybe under, or what's the word I'm thinking of here?
Undervalued or under weighted.
Yeah, underweighted. There you go. That maybe post NAFTA, in the last 15 years, they're really, but it doesn't spread across the state evenly. In other words, when
Hmm.
you look at the country, 2/3 of trade by vehicle, not trade by sea freight, but by vehicle freight, that's happening in Texas. 2/3 of that, and then 2/3 of what's happening in Texas is happening in Laredo.
Hmm.
And so it's not, every city, every county isn't asking, hey, can we look at freight here? It's really important. Whereas to us, it's like massive, it's vital. But if you look at the formula, the amount of funds that we get. So, in other words, a couple questions. One, uh, can you speak to what those formulas are, which categories look at freight? And then number two, what do you think would be a good way for us who do we need to talk to impact the way those formulas are derived so that it is placed a stronger importance on freight.
Yeah. So category two, that metropolitan mobility and rehabilitation type stuff from the not seven, but category two, the one that goes out to all the MPOs. That's the one that has the freight aspect in it in the formula, and that's the one where it's most highly considered as far as allocations by formula. So, and every so often, Tempo, the Texas Association of MPOs, gets together and looks at that formula along in cooperation with TxDOT, with TPP division and the districts to figure out, okay, have situations changed? Do we need to change the um, categories or criteria in the formula, and how would they be weighted? And I'll tell you, there are very, very spirited discussions that occur when these things happen. And we went through this process a couple of years or so ago. And then we got into a legislative session. And then now we're getting close to the census. I'm going to suggest or think that there's likely going to be some relooking at those formulas based on what happens with the census and the population. Freight or truck volumes is the way it's addressed in the formula. Truck volumes are one of about 5 or 6 or 7 criteria, along with population, total VMT, and some other things. So if you want another look at that or that to be reconsidered, that would be best addressed through Tempo for right now. And then if you wanted to, you could always address it through TPMP. I would start with your district and then with Sarah Garza, your TPMP rep, and kind of let it flow up the chain that way.
Thank
Does
you.
that help out?
Yes.
And then, so just kind of to tag on to that a little bit, if you have some corridors or some major projects that are freight related, that is a major concern and issue with TxDOT overall along the border, but in other major metro areas where there's seaports and there's a lot of truck or inland ports and those types of things too, the energy sectors. Developing projects that have a freight issue with them or freight improvement or addressing issues. That's another place where if y'all are putting some of your category 2 and category 7, and especially if you have any city or economic development corporation funds starting to leverage those, you're more likely to get some more category 4 and category 12 funding to supplement that. So developing projects with that freight emphasis and showing how that's going to help with congestion overall, but especially with the freight, it's good to be able to start trying to leverage your funding, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Very good question and discussion to bring up right there. Matt, let's go to the next slide if we don't have any more questions right now. All right. So let's talk for a few minutes about funding realities. We went through the basic description of the funds. But one bullet point that I want to address is nothing is always guaranteed. Federal funds, okay, so the things that provide the Category 7 and a portion of the Category 2 funds that's federal, those are typically the most consistent because they're based on multi-year legislative bills from Congress. You know, again, they used to be pretty much always 6-year bills, and they went sometimes to a 5-year. Then we had the 2-year MAP 21 and the shorter term FAST Act. Then you have continuing resolutions that kind of keep the funding going. We are due for a new transportation bill. Um, I want to point out, because this is a question that'll come up at sometimes and kind of goes back to how can we influence anything? It's very important to realize the MPO cannot use its federal planning dollars to lobby the state level or the federal level decision makers. Now, when there's a process to address a formula, like with that Category 2 stuff, that's fine. That's part of the deal. But if someone wants to try to talk with Congress or even the state and say, we need more money, that's best done and appropriately done by individual members of, say, your policy board acting on behalf of their city or county or those agencies. It just needs to be clear that you're not using your federal planning dollars that support the MPO planning process for that. That just comes up every so often, so I thought I would just bring it up. The state funding, I mentioned earlier the Prop 1 and the Prop 7, those are more variable depending on the price of oil and natural gas, especially for Proposition 1. And then Proposition 7 sometimes depends on the overall economy, which again in Texas is sometimes driven by the price of oil and gas. But those are the ones where that can cause ebbs and flows or peaks and valleys in the cash flow forecast that TxDOT has. And that's where sometimes it can be said, we may have to trim back on some projects in the outer years as we're looking at decreases in these tax revenues at the state level. Again, as much uncertainty as those can cause in Texas, we're very fortunate that we have those supplemental sources of funding because there's a lot of states that don't have, whether it's sales tax or severance tax on oil and gas production, these extra funds, and they're more completely dependent on or primarily dependent on federal funds. And that sometimes just isn't enough to make everything happen.
Of the state's total transportation funding, Bill, what percentage would you say typically in a given year? I know it fluctuates, but would you say is the federal portion and the state portion?
You know, I would really have to go back, and there's a pie chart in the UTP, and I haven't looked at it recently enough, and I'm afraid I would. It's going to be less than half, I believe. So, and if I don't know if it's a third or a quarter overall, because we have a lot of different state funding sources and things, but
Okay,
it's I believe it's less than half.
yeah, you directed me right to it. It is in the
Okay,
UTP. It's 37%.
so I was kind of in the right ballpark with a third.
So
Okay,
37% is federal, and
yeah.
so the majority is state funding.
Which is important to realize, but it also, because we're 2/3 dependent or almost 2/3 on the state funding, as those volumes of taxable or of revenue vary, we become a little bit more uncertain as far as cash flow. But overall, it's been very helpful, of course, to have those sources of funding. And I've already mentioned leveraging funds, and I'll just kind of reiterate, just when you're coming up with especially some unique or innovative projects or these major projects that serve more than just Laredo, that's where it's important to say, hey, we're going to put some skin in the game. We're going to put some of our Category 2, Category 7. And I've seen parts of the state, and I think Midland and Odessa have done probably, especially for areas the size of Laredo and comparable size, they've done an incredible job of taking some of their economic development funds and putting those toward infrastructure in the name of economic development, improving loops, building interchanges on freeways, and helping out with a variety of those types of things. So that's an opportunity again that might help bring in some more of the Category 12 and maybe even more Category 4 funding. Next slide. Okay, let's go ahead and swing into some of the different types of planning issues that are dealt with by the MPO, things that need to be looked at. Asset management is one of them. This gets into the conditions of pavement, bridges. You know, there's a IRI. It's basically a rideability index, a smoothness index for pavement. Bridges are inspected frequently to find out, are they in poor, good, better? I can't remember the exact, but you know, from poor to best condition. And that's done at a statewide level. But, you know, are we maintaining, are we able to keep our existing transportation system going? Um, Extreme weather events. Y'all don't have to deal with hurricanes like they do on the coast, but you can have things dealing with drought where uh, pavement structure might fail or suffer because of heat, dry conditions for an extended period of time, and so on. So there's a variety of things that need to be considered there. Safety and security sometimes get lumped together, but they're really two different things. Safety, of course, dealing with crashes, fatalities. We used to say, according to the federal guidance, incapacitating injuries. They've recently changed that a couple years ago to suspected serious injuries, and there's reasons. It's very challenging for judgment calls to be made by the investigating law enforcement officers about the severity of an injury, but working through that. But basically, what can we do to minimize the risk of people dying or being seriously injured on our roadways? And then security really gets into um, threats, natural disaster or human-made disasters, threats to the transportation system, keeping the system running, that type of thing. Then economic development is something that's always key. Um, it's very important that some of the funding goes to the roadways that will help the area either sustain its industry or even grow the types of industry that the area wants to bring in. And that can be locally generated or attracted traffic. And the obvious one in Laredo is all the truck traffic with the cross border, even the drayage that occurs between the border and distribution or warehouses. And then once they're ready to take the trucks out of the area, whether it's long haul or to an intermodal facility or whatever, and then through traffic as well. Next slide. Freight and passenger mobility. There's the different types of these things. Transit, especially for the size and population of Laredo, is very, very important, more so than probably any area of similar population because of the people who are dependent on the transit system, whether they live in Laredo itself or come across the border to work or go to school, whatever it might be. And then as well, there's a lot of people who are dependent on walking and bicycling around Laredo. And so those modes all have to be considered uh, in the development of roads, the upgrading of roads, the planning for different systems, and so on.
A little
Environmental,
plug, Bill.
yeah,
A little plug for our active transportation plan. We are in the final stages of bringing that plan for adoption to the
excellent.
MPO Policy Committee, to our Laredo City Council, and to the Webb County Commission.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear the progress on that.
We're excited about it too. Thank you.
And that'll be a good example. One, that's going to be something you'll be able to kind of put that feather in your hat for your next certification review in a few years. And it's also the type of thing that you'll be able to kind of brag on and maybe some peer exchanges with other MPOs around the state and possibly even the country. So, again, especially the size y'all are. Environmental justice, referred to as EJ in Title VI. Kirk is going to talk about this more this afternoon from the federal perspective, but basically the teaser here is we have to make sure that regardless of ethnic background, color of skin, poverty level, income level, household income, all those types of things, we want to make sure that everyone has as much of as possible equal access to the transportation system. And again, if that means someone doesn't have an automobile or only has one or two in the house and they need more transportation, how can they get to a transit stop? Do we have a way for them to walk or bicycle to the transit stop and so on? It's looking at the holistic population and make sure we're serving everyone, as well as we don't have projects that damage or harm anyone in particular or vulnerable population groups. ITS, Intelligent Transportation System, management, operations. This has a lot to do with how do we keep the system running? How do we keep traffic flowing? Intelligent Transportation System is everything from the cameras and the dynamic message signs that might say there's a wait of so long at this border crossing, or right lane is blocked ahead because of a crash, take an alternate route, or whatever it is, all the way down to traffic signals that have the detectors, and timing can be either automatically or manually changed to accommodate different traffic flows, whether it's just the change in typical peak hours on a weekday basis or special events and so on. And then also, how are we spending money to maintain all the way from city and county streets up to the state highways and that type of thing? And are we doing things operationally that help keep traffic flowing? Do we have right turn lanes where we need them? Do we have what we call the free, the dedicated right turn lane at an intersection, or even when you get into freeways, the directional connectors on interchanges and flyovers, anything that again helps mobility to the best that it can. And then there's other things, environmental mitigation, sustainability, livability. We want to make sure we're doing everything we can to minimize harm to the air, the water. I call them the critters, wherever we have species that are endangered or threatened and those types of things, we want to make sure either we don't harm the habitat or we do something to mitigate that, as well as standing water, wetlands, temporary situations, all that type of thing. And then sustainability and livability come into play. And these will come up later, I believe, also. But again, what are we doing? And this is where it's really cooperative with, say, the city who has the land use control. Are we working as the MPO working with the city? Hey, are they trying to encourage, higher density development or mixed use developments where people aren't as dependent on getting in their car and driving several blocks or several miles for everything they need every day? So there's just a few little teasers at that. Next. Okay. This is a teaser into kind of an afternoon session as well, but for everyone that's only participating in this session, some people will say, what's the big deal about the whole transportation planning process? I mean, why do we do it and so what? Well, if we follow a transportation planning process, and we're going to discuss these later on this afternoon, but that's including involving the public, engaging stakeholders, whether they're private sector, public sector, and we look at a way to kind of rank projects, not just, oh, so-and-so has a pet project and they want that done. It's really what's going to help us address the needs, help us meet the goals and the visions of the community overall. That will help the decision makers, the MPO Policy Board, as well as everyone all the way up to the State Transportation Commission, to make the best informed decisions possible. And so it's very important that we do follow these processes and then we have it documented. And it's kind of it'll result typically in the best projects that are needed. It's also a little bit of a safeguard, maybe, that when someone comes up and says, these are the projects we selected, let's just say someone comes out of the woodwork and says, well, why'd you pick that project instead of this one? Well, here's our process we went through. It wasn't just arbitrarily picked out or selected. And that's kind of a good safeguard for everyone. It provides accountability and so on.
Bill,
Next. Yes, go ahead.
just to let you know, we've got about 10 minutes left if you're planning to leave any time for questions at the end.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Appreciate that.
No
Let's go to the next slide. So, in fact, one thing that allows for some questions right now, if someone wants to address any of these or not, but what works best related to transportation planning decisions in the Laredo area? I'm kind of curious to know, and this might generate some Q&A and discussion, but what's worked best in the past and what are some ways to improve? And this will be a way to kind of open up into that Q&A.
For that first question, can you provide a little more with what you're looking for there?
Yeah, so basically, if people who have some institutional or institutional knowledge or experience having been in Laredo for a while, has there been something about the project selection process, or has there been something about the way that we engage the public, or anything else that's kind of helped with the
So maybe a good way to
Yeah.
ask would be, does anyone have an example of a transportation project that from planning to execution went really well? The public was involved, all the elected officials were involved. It was something we needed and it got done in the right time. And the planning part of it really made a difference. Can somebody think about a project, even a small one or a large one, where the planning process had a big impact on how a transportation project, a road, an alternative transportation project was implemented? Can anybody think of one?
And that's okay. All right. Well, we can go ahead and move on through these different plans and program documents that we need. And this may actually help stir up some of that discussion as well. Let's go to the next slide, Matt. Okay. So what we're getting into now are the key planning and programming documents that are out there. And the difference between planning and programming is planning is looking at the comprehensive needs. What projects, what corridors, what strategies, what capital improvements do we need to make to improve the system? Programming is when we say, okay, we've got a project that we're going to build in a certain year using one or more certain categories of funding, and we have the money to write that check, so to speak. Next. Okay. The UPWP, the Unified Planning Work Program, is a document that's basically the MPO staff budget and work plan that says what they're going to work on. Some places do it for 1 year at a time, some places do it for 2 years at a time. This is primarily funded by the federal planning funds. Some come from highway, a little bit comes from the transit side. This funds the staff, the equipment they need, and any contracted work that they do. Next. The MTP is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. This is the long-range plan. This has the projects that the MPO is going to build with the partner agencies. Has to always have at least a 20-year outlook. Places do them looking out 25 years at least. Sometimes they'll go 26 or 27 years to get to that next 5 or 10-year increment. In Laredo, it's updated on a 5-year cycle because you are in attainment of air quality. Has to be multimodal, cover all the modes, has to be consistent with the statewide long-range transportation plan, which is a set of policies and priority corridors. It's going to have a discussion text dealing with all the different issues and factors affecting transportation, from demographics to land use. What are the major issues in your areas, like, for instance, freight and truck traffic and so on. It's going to have a project list that has to be fiscally constrained for at least the first 10 years. Then the second 10 to 15 years, you can say, well, we have generally the funding expected to pay for these types of things. And then you can have illustrative projects which identified funding has not been secured for. It'll have strategies to address the needs, the plan will, and so on. It'll show a public involvement process. It'll talk about things like environmental mitigation. Next. The MTP has to include performance measures and targets and discussions about those, about how projects are going to help achieve those. We're going to talk more about the performance-based planning this afternoon. Next. Here's some additional requirements of the MTP from a federal perspective. The financial plan that shows you have the money to pay for the projects. A system performance report is to say, hey, when we've built certain projects, especially to address safety or congestion, how did we do? Did we get what we were looking for? Next. Here's the programming documents. The TIP, Transportation Improvement Program, is a 4-year document. Those projects all have identified funding, and unless something major happens, they will be let in each of those 4 fiscal years. It's consistent with the first 4 years of the MTP. So if you have a project in the TIP, that same project has to be in your MTP with the same description and everything. The STIP is the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. I need to fix this slide. It's now all 23 MPO TIPs, and there's really 24 rural TIPs because Houston doesn't have any rural area. But it's all the MPO and all the TxDOT rural TIPs, along with all those statewide programs like bridge and safety and transportation alternatives and so on. And then the UTP, we hear a lot about this more and more. This is something that's unique to Texas in that they call it a UTP. Other states have them, some don't. But this is a 10-year list of program projects. And this is what really helps with the cash flow forecasting. And this is where you'll find out, yes, our project has been approved all the way up to the state level, and it's in there for the funding from the category 2, 7, 4, 12, all those types of categories. Next. So basically, this is how TIP and STIP and MTP relate. Projects that are in the MTP get fed into the TIP. The first 4 years, again, of the MTP is what comprises the TIP. Everything has to be consistent. Next. This is just a graphic to show how all the TIPs and all the statewide and non-metro things get put into the STIP. Next. So projects that are inside the metropolitan TIP, again, have to be in the MTP. They need to be able to identify how do the projects in the TIP, again, how are they going to address congestion and mobility and other different types of targets that we're trying to achieve through the performance-based planning that we'll go through this afternoon. You can also well, let me back up before I say this next thing. If you have a project that has even $1 of federal funds in it, it has to be in your MTP and has to be in your TIP. You can have other projects that are non-federally funded included if you want to, especially if they're what's considered regionally significant, meaning they're going to address issues that go really beyond just your metropolitan area boundary, or maybe significantly within that boundary. Next.
Bill, just a heads up, we got about 1 minute left.
Okay, thanks. Here's some other components of the TIP: project descriptions, financial plan to show that you're constrained, and then how are you achieving targets. Next. That's just showing the how projects come out of the MTP and become the 4 years of the TIP. Next. The approval process, the MPO will put together the TIP. The policy board approves it. It goes up to the governor for approval. And then the TIP is included in the STIP without any changes. Next. And then the federal government, Federal Highway Administration approves the STIP at the statewide level. Here's just some other things about the TIP that are kind of detailed you can go back to if you want to, but a little bit of how the sausage is made, really just for kind of reference. Different types of amendments and updates. If you're going to make a major change to a project in terms of certain threshold of cost or scope, it has to go through an actual full amendment and go through the public engagement process. Next. And then with that, I think we're at the end of this module. So if there are any questions,
Bill, if I can,
yeah.
since it's 11, what I'd like to do is excuse anybody who needs to leave the meeting. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
We're going to continue recording. And if there are those that want to do a little Q&A, we'll extend this 5 or 10 minutes or so that Bill can answer some questions. But again, thank you very much for attending. This is the first of 4 sessions. The next 3 are this afternoon, if you're able to attend. If not, we're recording every meeting, and we'll make those meetings available for everybody that was in the mailing list. Even if you whether you signed up for one or not, you're going to get all these meetings so you can watch them later. So thank you to Bill and TTI, and thank you everybody for making time to attend. If you have to excuse yourself for your next meeting or appointment, feel free. Otherwise, if you want to stick around for 5 or 10 more minutes based on questions, we'll have a little Q&A.
Definitely. And thanks again, everyone, for your attention and for being part of this.
How are you doing, Kirby? Bill, this is Tito Gonzalez with the TechStat, the Director of TP&D for the Laredo District. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to see you, Tito.
Good to see you. And I just wanted to reiterate and thank
Tito,
you for that presentation.
we can barely hear you. Is there any way you can...
I'm sorry. Let me see. I'm on my iPad. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Can you hear me better now?
A little bit.
I just wanted to, first say thank you for that information and just stress, like what you said, the importance of having involvement from the local governments, the MPO, when TechStat is putting together our UTP calls. It is important that we get that local input and prioritizations from the city. I know we are constantly trying to improve that process and get more public engagement when it comes to prioritizing and planning our projects. I know it's a cycle every year, right? We just got done in August getting approved for 2020. Now we're moving on to FY21. So the process will start again. And as always, the earlier, the better that we can get those type of projects from the city and that input. It really goes a long way in helping with our planning process. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that and say that we always look forward to working with the local government.
Thank you, Tito. Do we have any
Thank you very
questions
much
out
for adding
there?
that in.
Do we have any questions out there for Bill, for the TTI team? Any questions about the planning process or the MPO in general? Okay, well, Bill,
All right.
thank you very much for taking this time. We look forward.
Oh.
Just one thing. This is Robert Rodriguez with Texas also. Just to
Yes,
make
you got
sure
a
and we
question for
clarify
us.
something.
Good, let's hear your question.
When you and just to clarify, and I guess just to reiterate what you said, the projects when they have a dollar of federal funds, they need to be included into the MTP. Now this includes construction, right of way, design, preliminary design, right? Correct?
Yes.
Through any phase.
Yes, sir. That's correct. Thank you for
Okay.
clarifying that.
Thank you.
It's nice to know people were paying attention and have some good specific questions or reiterations or clarifications. That's cool.
All right, Bill, you got any last comments for us before we end the meeting?
Not really. Just appreciate everyone's attention and participation and look forward to seeing those that can make the 1 o'clock session.
All
And
right.
I'll say this, I wish I was in Laredo to get some of that good Mexican food that I've learned to like down there so much.
Well, that day will come again, Bill.
I look forward to it. All right. We'll see you all in a little while.
All right, thank you, everybody. We'll see you this afternoon.